Several weeks ago, Professor Chomsky presented some of the material in these lectures to an audience at Ryerson Polytechnical Institute in Toronto, after which he was questioned by a panel of Canadian journalists. This is David Frum, Associate Editor of Saturday Night Magazine.
Professor Chomsky, you argue for a model of the media in which the media argue for and defend the established institutions of society, and any deviation from that defense is dismissed or even suppressed, so that views that dissent from the overwhelming consensus that characterizes our society cannot get a hearing. Now, here you are tonight in a large lecture hall at Canada's most prestigious journalism school, speaking to an audience of journalists who are hearing your remarks with apparent approbation. Your remarks are being broadcast on the government-owned radio network as part of the most prestigious lecture series on that network. How'd that happen?
Recall that what I said was that this is a very good first approximation to the description of a complex social institution. Now, you remember that I mentioned, I'm afraid this remark may sound a little insulting, but let me try to say it without sounding that way. I specifically mentioned that in the United States, for example, if I wasn't talking about, say, listener-supported radio in a small community. In fact, as you get away from the elite centers that matter, things open up. Okay. Now, the fact of the matter is that Canada is a much more open society in this respect than the United States, and the reason is it's less important. This generalizes. I can talk this way in Belgium, in Israel, in Latin America. I can't talk. I mean, I can talk this way in the United States, but not on national radio and television because it's just too important. What people think about international affairs in Canada just doesn't matter that much to established power. If it did matter that much, Canada would close up too.
If CBC then is just a small, a publicly funded station in some small town, looked upon in that perspective, why don't we turn to the CBC person on stage here, and Margaret Daly, perhaps you can have a turn.
Well, I was intrigued by the thesis and particularly impressed by the volume of sort of factual documentation. And I look forward to reading this stuff in a long version. I guess the question that I want to ask, though, is given that this information isn't discussed, you lay it all out, supposing people knew it. And obviously individuals do know it. Minorities, intellectuals, foreign affairs buffs, if you want to call them that, those kinds of people can assemble all this information. Then what it doesn't seem to make any difference, and why is that?
Well, I think it does make a difference. I think it makes a lot of difference. I mentioned, not entirely jocularly, that if a third world country today were to put forth the American Constitution, we'd call it a reversion to Nazism. And I mentioned that that's a sign of hope and progress. There has been moral progress over 200 years. There's also been progress over 20 years, 30 years, in my active lifetime. Again, I'm talking mostly about the United States, but it's a different country than it was 20 or 30 years ago. Now, elites are not different. They're pretty much as indoctrinated as they always were. Elite group, contrary to a lot of necessary illusion, elite groups, including liberal intellectual elites, did not oppose the Vietnam War. They supported the Vietnam War, supported it enthusiastically. They began to turn against it somewhat after Wall Street turned against it, and more or less for the same reasons, because it was too costly. The media were almost totally closed to critics of the war. But among the general population, this crisis of democracy did take place, and it changed the society. I think it led to probably, I hope, a permanent cultural change outside the elite centers. And the United States is just a different country than it was 20 years ago in a lot of respects. Everything from interpersonal relations to treatment of ethnic minorities to concern over international affairs and so on. You can see, and the reason is because outside of while the major institutions of indoctrination continue on their natural course, other modes of interaction did develop, and they remained, they're informal, they're inefficient. They may, I spend probably 80%, I don't know, some huge percent of my time traveling around the country giving talks. Well, that's less efficient than writing for a major journal, but people do this, and ultimately it makes a difference. There are solidarity groups, there are all kind of organizations and so on, and they do make a difference. You can see it. So take, for example, I mentioned the U.S. attack against South Vietnam in the early 1960s. You compare the early 1960s with the 1980s, that's 20 years. When Ronald Reagan came into office, his administration, in my view, intended to emulate John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, except their target was Central America. They came out with a white paper in February 1981, right after they came into office, virtually a declaration of war. The communists are taking over the world, we've got to go in there and stop them. It was a precursor to direct U.S. military intervention in Central America. Now what happened? What happened was, and the media, incidentally, bought the whole story. There was virtually no criticism of the white paper when it came out, just enthusiastic support for it. However, the general population didn't, because the population is not what it was in the early 60s. When John F. Kennedy started sending the American Air Force to bomb South Vietnam on a regular basis, there was no protest. You couldn't get two people together in a living room to talk about it. And it didn't have to be hidden either. It was on the front page of the newspapers. Nobody cared. We want to bomb another country? Great. Let's go to the next thing. When Ronald Reagan's administration sort of indicated that they might try to turn to direct military intervention, there was a convulsion in the country. People started coming out of the woodworks. It ranged from a massive flow of letters to Washington, to demonstrations, to church groups getting involved. A whole array of protests began to develop spontaneously without any organization and structure. The reason is the country is just a lot different. Well, what happened? What happened is that the Reagan administration backed off. They, in fact, told the media to cool the rhetoric, to cut back the inflammatory rhetoric. They were afraid that much more central themes of their program would be endangered. After all, remember that they were trying to ram through a program that the population was strongly opposed to, a domestic economic program. They were trying to ram through destruction of the limited welfare measures that exist in the United States, a huge transfer of resources from the poor to the rich, a massive increase in state power, and huge public subsidy to high technology industry through the Pentagon system and so on. All of these things are contrary to what the public wanted, and they didn't want any protest about them. So what they did was back off from their inflammatory proclamations about Central America, and they went underground. That's what the Iran-Contra hearings were about. The administration was driven underground. The domestic population would not tolerate the activities that they wanted to carry out, and they therefore had to turn to illegal clandestine activities. Now, the Reagan administration was notorious for the level of its clandestine activities. And clandestine activities are a pretty good measure of popular dissidence. If there isn't any popular dissidence, you don't have to carry out clandestine activities. You can carry out overt international terrorism and violence, which is much more efficient. Overt violence is much more efficient than clandestine violence for obvious reasons. I mean, for one thing, it's just more efficient to do. For another thing, there isn't any risk that it will be exposed, which will cause, a scandal and so on and so forth. And in fact, the state was driven underground by popular dissidents. Well, that's important. Those are, I think that's one of the many reflections of the difference between the 1960s and the 1980s. I think and in fact, even the media are different. Bad as they are, I mean, as you can see, I'm no great enthusiast for the elite media, but they're better than they were 20 years ago. I mean, they're not as closed and restricted and constrained as they were 20 years ago. And that includes the elite media. So there are slow changes. And I think there is a slow move towards general democratization, much too slow, but not insignificant. And those are things that, first of all, one can be somewhat hopeful about, but it also teaches you a lesson. It means there are things you can do. After all, these are societies. Our societies, like Canada and the United States, have one tremendous virtue. The state is very restricted in its capacity to use force against citizens. By comparative, it's not zero, but by comparative standards, it's low. And that means there's a great range of options available. People want to make use of them, and many do, and it makes a difference.
Noam Chomsky. I'm Lister Sinclair.